So yeah, I was going to talk about Phonegap, and I still am. But when Paul asked me to talk, Phonegap was the topic. But as I kind of started making the slides and kind of going through the whole presentation, I actually kind of thought, well, actually Phonegap is so small and so easy, there's not going to be much of a presentation in it. So the presentation is going to be kind of split between kind of two halves. In the first half, I'm just going to talk about Phonegap and kind of making HTML apps with Phonegap, in a kind of very kind of straightforward sort of sense. And there's probably going to be nothing too controversial in that. In the second half, it kind of gets much more opinionated because I kind of talk more about the kind of what I think is a good approach to making apps and a good style of coding them, and kind of things that kind of go more kind of beyond just how do I kind of functionally wrap up an app in as HTML, say HTML app, and how do it kind of goes into kind of ideas about how to make it kind of better from an architectural point of view, kind of what kind of styles of programming can make kind of apps more kind of responsive and quicker and that kind of thing. So that's when I'm going to kind of kick off kind of with these guys down here, kind of my friends. So before I kind of go kind of too far into this whole kind of question of HTML apps versus native apps, and kind of the whole kind of religious war between kind of the two approaches. Kind of in our own office, it was a bit kind of tense. There was kind of one developer who was very much kind of native, and then I come from a multimedia point of view, so I'm kind of from a kind of a JavaScript HTML kind of point of view anyway. And it was Paul kind of made the really good point that actually it's not about kind of HTML versus native, because all of these things they're really hybrid apps to begin with. And kind of in kind of my own reading around it, there's kind of one kind of point of view on this which I thought was pretty good. So you should kind of stop thinking about it being a kind of a binary choice between HTML apps and native, and kind of think of it more of a scale kind of that goes between HTML and native. And kind of it could be kind of brought down to 5 points, which is a pure HTML app. So kind of no native wrapping, no nothing. Kind of think of something like Save to Home Screen on iOS, or Firefox OS, where there's kind of no native layer. It's all HTML. Or even kind of just think about very well designed website or web app kind of that's accessed through a browser, but which is so well designed that it might as well be an app. And then as you kind of move on down through kind of these 5 points, kind of the next step might be okay, so you have just a purely HTML app that's wrapped up in a very kind of shallow native container that does nothing except just kind of shows a web view and has the HTML running inside. And the next step down along then would be kind of more kind of traditional Phonegap approach, which is so you have a HTML app wrapped up in a container, but it's accessing kind of native layer services like kind of gyroscopes and cameras and things like that, and contacts and whatever you have. Oops. And then next along again, something else which we've done with Cordova in our office, kind of mix HTML and native components at the same time on screen. So it's kind of really kind of truly kind of hybrid, and you have from even a user's point of view, you have native and HTML mix, and then the last step is pure native. And just I found kind of thinking about it like that. One is kind of a better kind of view of looking at the world, and you're less scared to kind of jump out of HTML and less scared to make dependencies with native, and also it kind of breaks this whole tension of is it native or HTML. So web apps, yeah, like I was saying, so this is kind of saved to the home screen on iOS or installable apps, and kind of two things that make this kind of nice if you're going to do it. One is make sure you include all the launch icons in your root directory and link to them from your index page. And then this is also quite nice. So this is supported by kind of all the major kind of browsers now. So this is a cache manifest. So you can state in your web app which files are static, so that when a user kind of goes to it the first time, they all get saved. They're there in a very kind of hard cache. so that when the user comes back to it, there's no loading of those files. It's only kind of ones that are left out or ones that are explicitly said to be, you do not cache. Those are the only ones that are called. And for a user who saves this kind of app to the home screen, then the response is just really quick and very kind of natively feeling. But what I'm going to talk about kind of tonight is making gaps with Adobe Phonegap, or the open source file is called is Apache Cordova. So this is an application framework for making hybrid apps, and it targets kind of all the major formats. So it's since I think version 2 is kind of trimmed down. So really, it's just looking at, especially when I'm going to show you later on, it's only targeting kind of the main kind of Windows, iOS, and Android. And what's nice about it from a hybrid point of view is that it's built with a plug-in architecture. So even the default kind of native layer kind of accessor services, they're all written as plugins. So if you if you have some kind of service, you want to write some kind of something you're accessing at a native layer, you could just kind of can write your Java or your Objective-C, and you kind of plug kind of very neatly into the whole architecture. And it's open source, which kind of adds to it. But one thing that this doesn't do is it doesn't have any kind of UI. So it doesn't kind of give you native kind of widgets. It doesn't give you kind of any kind of widgets except just kind of what comes in the browser. So I'm kind of calling this kind of bring your own UI. And there are frameworks out there like kind of jQuery Mobile, Essential Touch, those kind of things, which can kind of plug into this and give a native look and feel. Personally, I actually hate it because I don't think you ever kind of get the real native feel from HTML widgets that are kind of skinned to try to ape the native look and feel. I prefer to kind of go off and kind of make a completely different user experience. But if you did want to ape it, they're there. So I'm going to jump in. This is where things get scary because we don't have a proper internet connection here. So I'm going to jump in and show how a Cordova or a Phonegap app gets built. So this is the Cordova website. This is where you can download all the build tools, whatever. There's kind of 3 approaches if you want to build it. Either you can download all the jars and everything you need and kind of build it through a Eclipse or whatever IDE you use or from the command line. There is 2 other approaches which are kind of much nicer, which is a nice integrated command line interface where you can just do something as simple as create, name your project, Cordova, add platform Android, Cordova, build Android, and it's built. So I'd recommend doing that if you're going to do it from the command line. But then there's another approach which I'm going to show you here, and this is the approach that's supported by Adobe, who's kind of the commercial partner behind all this, and it's through it's kind of build in the cloud. So you get your HTMLs, you zip them up, and you upload it to their site, and magically they spit out the binaries for iOS or Android and Windows. So that's what I'm going to show you here. And that's done on this site here, which is build.phonegap.com. So if you sign up with your Adobe login, you log into this, you get to a page like this. We have 2 options. One, open source, which we're going to do tonight, and then the other is a private app. So if you sign up to free account, you get 1 private app and you get as many open source apps as you want. The nice trick is, you can just, make your apps, just delete them one at a time. You don't care, you got the binaries, but anyway. So I made a simple app here. It looks much more complicated than it is because I built it using a kind of a skeleton framework called the Html5 Boilerplate for mobile. So it's got a whole lot of files which I'll talk about later on, kind of what they do. But the most important things now for this is, so we have an index here, which is kind of the index of our HTML. What's important to add is inside here, hopefully the internet connection still holds. Okay. Inside here, the one thing you've got to add to to make it all work. So it expects a JavaScript file called phonegap.js. So just add that to your index. And then there's a couple of files that are good to add. So there's a configuration file here, config.xml. And this does kind of your cross-platform configuration. So there's tags here that are specific to iOS or specific to Android. And then there's kind of generic ones that kind of float from them all. So the simple things like, what's the name of your app, description of it, author, that kind of thing. Because Phonegap is plugin based, you've got to say what plugins you want to add. So in this app is a kind of waypointers type app. So it uses the GPS to figure out where you are. You can save your current position. It gets added to a list, and then you can track back to where you are. So that's got to be added there. It has a link out to an in-app browser, so I've added in the in-app browser plugin. When all that is done, you can put it up in GitHub. Get the Git URL. Put it up. So it's getting it. So this won't depend on our internet connection because it's in the cloud. So it's got that. To build it, just simple as we're ready to build. It says, so iOS failed because I didn't have a developer cert. Android is building, Windows is building. And when they're done, so Windows is done, Android is done, and it's really this simple. So you have a QR code here, which you can scan, hopefully. Yep. Yeah, you download your app. One meg, hopefully it won't be too long. That's it, download it. Install. Open. And that's your app. So you see why that doesn't really make much of a presentation, because that's really all there's to it. What does matter is kind of from here on, kind of how does your app kind of work for a user, and that's the kind of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about next. And this is very opinionated now. This is kind of what I think kind of makes a good app, and how you can write your HTML and JavaScript to work really well. First of all, there's this, which isn't too opinionated. This is kind of how do you get that look and feel. So you're starting off with just a browser, and browsers are written to show documents, and most apps aren't document based. So in order to kind of tweak it to make it look and behave like the kind of thing that you want to develop here, you got to do a whole lot of tweak with the CSS. So there's things like the default zooming. So by default, a browser assumes you want to see the whole document. Maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you probably don't want the user to be able to pinch and zoom, so you got to turn that off. You probably don't want them to be able to copy and paste images, so you got to turn that off. You got to fix the way the window scrolls. Kind of you don't want telephone numbers in your app to suddenly link. So you kind of, the first step, you got to go and fight the browser and make it do what you want to do. The other thing you probably want to do, so Android and iOS added a 300 millisecond delay to all clicks. You probably don't want that. You probably want it, that, for me, I think that's the one thing that kind of makes HTML apps feel slow if you don't kind of remove this 300 millisecond delay. So there's loads of libraries to do that, and there's kind of a standard way to do it yourself. The one I use is energized.js, so you would just add this to your HTML and suddenly everything kind of goes much more quicker. Then there's a couple of weird kind of tricks that in WebKit, 3D transitions in CSS are much quicker than 2D transitions in CSS because they're hardware accelerated. So if you want your app to really swoosh, just use 3D. You don't need to change the Z index. It's probably just like transitioning on a 2D plane. But if you do it as a 3D one, it'll move much quicker. And there's also a kind of pain in the ass, which is that the first animation is always crappy because it takes a moment for the hardware acceleration to kind of kick in. So the very first thing your app should do is just do some kind of dummy animation, or kind of make the body kind of the back view of the body in a 3D perspective invisible, and suddenly the browser knows that we're going to be using 3D here, so it turns on the hardware acceleration. Now we get into the opinionated stuff. So when I'm developing, I like to use an MVP pattern, and there's two reasons for this. One is I think MVP, which is model, view, presenter. So this is the style where you it assumes a kind of well-formed widgets, and it assumes your model is there, and it assumes that you can bind these together in some kind of fashion. It doesn't need to be complete bindings, but there's a tight coupling between your view and your model. So it's like MVVM in that case, except you're allowed to you have a presenter, what's called a presenter. So you're allowed every now and then to kind of reach in and tweak DOM elements, or directly access kind of view elements and change them the way you want. So for me, this just seems like a sensible approach to developing anyway, but I think it's particularly good for HTML app development. And the reason for this is because it puts an awful lot of focus on the HTML and CSS. And the reason why I think this is good is because in that case, you're more or less in a native layer anyway, because you're not kind of struggling with an interpreted language like JavaScript to go and kind of do this, go do the other, and having to do all that. You just kind of give explicit commands to what's probably C++ to add a button here, and then what's shown to the user is a native button for all intents and purposes. So I like the idea of having the bulk of the HTML and bulk of the code in HTML and CSS, and then kind of go with a very kind of declarative approach to programming from there, and only use kind of a very kind of lightweight sort of presenter code in JavaScript. So it's only those kind of things that where the presenter needs to jump in and kind of tweak the DOM, or needs to massage the kind of data as it comes down. That's the only time that the JavaScript kind of kicks in. Everything else, as much as possible, you leave it just to HTML and CSS. So yeah, so elevate your HTML and your CSS, and always kind of prefer CSS styling and transitions rather than kind of trying to do animations or whatever in JavaScript. It's also cool too, because a lot of the stuff that you might be tempted to do in JavaScript, like kind of detect kind of orientation changes or whatever, you can just do all that declaratively in CSS anyway. So you can have kind of one app that's written for tablet and for mobile that kind of rotates nicely when a person rotates the device, and you don't need to kind of go through to JavaScript for that. So what I kind of, this is, you can't really see it, but here I have kind of that kind of classic kind of no-no, which is have kind of styling and events kind of actually written as attributes in the HTML, rather than kind of going through a kind of a needless step in JavaScript of having JavaScript add events, and then of course JavaScript is probably going to handle them, but from the point of view of kind of good practice, I think kind of wean yourself away from declarative, or wean yourself over to declarative programming, away from kind of imperative programming in JavaScript. And if you do kind of get to a point where you need to write some kind of special widget that's not supported by kind of the HTML5 kind of widget set, what you can do, so there is an upcoming standard called Web Component, and you can kind of mock this presently with a library called Polymer. So if you need to do something unique, you can write kind of your own web component using kind of an MVC type pattern, and then use that declaratively in your kind of wider kind of MVP application. Oops. So then from the model point of view, so Paul is actually our server team lead. So kind of the approach which we take and which I really like is having the server kind of drive the view. So they kind of pair the model and the view, and pair them kind of declaratively again. So there's there are ways that you can use kind of JavaScript to to do bindings, but there's also kind of declarative bindings. So again, kind of just kind of keeping the focus on HTML and CSS, I prefer to use kind of declarative bindings and templating like rivets and handlebars, and that, by kind of keeping this coupling between the model coming down from the server or coming from whatever inputs there are and the HTML, and kind of neglecting JavaScript in some way, kind of having as minimal JavaScript there as possible. You kind of hotwire your this kind of near native level in HTML with the data that's coming down. And so much opinionated again. So if it's not real time, use REST and JSON. That means you can just you can pipe it straight through from the model. It gets piped very quickly through JavaScript onto the view layer, and having the the data that comes down from the server kind of just don't massage it anyway. Just force it on through. And the same kind of if you're using real time, you can use WebSockets, and there's a nice standard I found called JSON RPC, and the same kind of thing, that you just get JSON down and you can just horse that straight through, and JavaScript kind of barely ever sees it. But again, kind of what I like about MVP is that it's not kind of really religious. If there's something that you need to do, that you need to massage the data in some way, that's okay too. Just go and do it. Be sensible. Or if you need to poke into the DOM and kind of tweak this thing and turn that off or change the color on that, and it's not entirely data driven, that's all right. But just kind of be sensible about kind of it's only the times when you need to do it. Otherwise, let the data, let CSS, let HTML kind of do its own thing. And yeah, so distill your JavaScript. So there are libraries that are optimized for mobile, like jQuery 2. So this is kind of jQuery, but with a lot of this stuff kind of pulled out. There's Zepto, which it seems to be the most popular one. The one I liked, just because it's specifically written for mobile devices, is Intel App Framework, a really catchy name. So it's another clone of jQuery, but I found it's the kind of quickest. But what we also found is kind of we were writing a whole lot of kind of jQuery that was just like this. It was just accessing some query selector, and then changing HTML on it, or changing the some attribute on it, and you don't need it. I mean, you can write that in vanilla JavaScript. It's there's the query selector API there, so you can still do everything we were doing in jQuery, but just in vanilla JavaScript. And I think that kind of shaves off a couple of milliseconds, and over the space of a whole app, those milliseconds add up. And finally, optimize your JavaScript with something like Google's closure compilers. That's kind of what I tend to use. And there's a nice API to it that you can, in a kind of your build process, you can use curl to upload it to Google servers. You don't need even anything installed local, and you get your optimized JS back. So this is kind of the stack I tend to use. So I mentioned HTML5 Boilerplate. So this is kind of comes with kind of a lot of those things I mentioned at the start. The viewport zooming, and kind of disabling kind of copy and paste, stuff like that. Kind of it's there kind of in a kind of a skeleton boilerplate sort of thing. So you can take that as your jumping off point for your application, and kind of a lot of the things which you might otherwise need to work out are just there for you to use. We have a kind of an expanded version of it, so we've kind of added to it with a very lightweight single page application framework, where we can define our app and then kind of swap in and out screens on the fly. What I tend to use too, so I tend not to have things binded. I use templating. Rivets I think is a nice kind of binding one if you want to use that. We've used Knockout too in the past, but it's a little kind of, it's very JavaScripty, so you start defining a whole lot of stuff in your own JavaScript, and I think that kind of defeats the kind of the pattern I'd like to aim for. Sass was talked about last week by Dave, really cool. Dave talked about CoffeeScript last week. I like TypeScript. So TypeScript is one of these kind of compiled to JavaScript languages made by Microsoft, boo. But what's cool about it is that it's a superset of JavaScript. So like I said before, I come from a multimedia point of view. So it's actually very much like ActionScript tree, where you have JavaScript but with classes and interfaces and modules and things like that. So you can do classical objective-oriented programming, and then in a language you're really familiar with, and then it compiles to virtually identical JavaScript. This is kind of so I've thrown this in for a Google Closure compiler, and then we tend to use Phonegap when we're wrapping things up. If even for nothing else, then it's a convenience, and all the things have been worked out for you in the past. That it's easy to kind of spend a little time kind of getting caught up in when you're making your own web views. So I think this is going to be up on the side at the end. Here are the links to Cordova. Just read the docs on Cordova Phonegap. It's really simple. The command line interface, that's what I use all the time. There is the compile in the cloud version, which I just showed you. That's here. And then you guys probably know these already, but these are resources which I kind of tend to kind of find myself going back to over and over again. So Mozilla's kind of docs on everything to do with the web, so it's kind of a wiki type documentation. This is more kind of articles which are really cool from Google, just on kind of upcoming standards, things like that. But it kind of gives you kind of nice ideas for how to work with kind of the technologies that are kind of falling out. And the same with this. So this is more kind of promoting the technologies and things like that.